Welcome back to another episode of Movies in Black and White. My name is Raf, and I'm joined, as always, by our lovely co-host, Mr. Jacob Holmes. Jacob, how you doing?
Doing good. Glad to be here. This is going to be an interesting episode for us, I think. Uh, just happy to be along for the ride.
Hell yeah. You're here to be a cool and supportive ally. You're not going to be saving me from anything. You're here along for the ride. So appreciate it. Today we're going to be talking about a very fun topic. We're going to be talking hood classics, which we'll get into what we mean by hood classics because I don't think that this is like an actual term that people use. I kind of just like made it up on my own. But because I didn't write it in like an academic paper or anything, it's not actually something that is like widely used within the film criticism community. So we're hoping to make it a thing. Um, Very excited for it. So for some background in terms of what we're talking about with Hood Classics today, I'm sort of defining these movies as the boom of 90s to like early 2000s independent black movies that are mostly based around growing up in the hood and the experience of living in the hood. To give some additional background, I think we can sort of think of these movies as being sort of post Do the Right Thing. So Do the Right Thing comes out in 1989, obviously a seminal movie in film history, probably one of the best movies ever made, a definitive movie about like race dynamics in America. And after the success of Do the Right Thing, I think a lot of like independent film studios realized like, oh, we can sort of try to replicate this magic with other up and coming young black directors telling stories about what it's like to be black and American. So we're going to be looking at things like Boys in the Hood, Menace to Society, Juice, all the way through things like Belly, Dead Presidents, Paid in Full, that kind of stuff. So these are movies for black audiences made by black creators about black experiences and in particular black experiences of people growing up in the hood. So Jacob, before we start jumping into like any of these movies, had you seen any of the movies that we were sort of talking about as like falling into this hood classics kind of genre, or was this something that was like totally foreign to you?
So, I had not seen basically any of the movies. I haven't heard of several of the movies you just named. Um, so, and that's part of the conversation, right? Is like, why, like, to what level would a white person be expected to know about these
Mhm.
movies? Like, is it even our movies to watch? But I did watch Boys in the Hood for this episode.
Hell
Thought it
yeah.
was absolutely fantastic. And I have watched a bit, I think most of Friday, which
Okay.
may or may not fall into this exact uh, category, but I do have a bit of a funny story to me that kind of like relates. So when I was in college, in my junior year, I had a black roommate named Morris. By choice, we were already friends before that, and we arranged it to be roommates on that year. And
Mhm.
at one point, we were talking about like childhood classic movies. Um, and like he had not seen like any of the Disney movies, like Lion King. Growing up, in the same age as me as a '90s kid, and so then I'm like, man, you haven't seen The Lion King? I was like, what was your favorite childhood movie? And he's like, Friday. I was like, it just like blew my mind. So that was like so far removed from my world. But I think it spoke a lot to the differences in the worlds where we grew up. And so I'm excited to be here and learn and find out more.
That's a hilarious story. So something like Friday, I get as being a movie that like a lot of black people have seen and something that is like a cherished movie for someone growing up. But like The Lion King plays in the hood. Like black people know Lion King. Like that's like a pretty black movie. Like
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Not that his experience not seeing Lion
yeah,
King should be representative of the hood. I think that was a Morris thing. That's just
yeah,
it was more about the fact that Friday was nowhere near any of my friends would have been watching Friday
yeah,
at any point in their childhood.
yeah.
So
Which is also something that we're going to talk about, right? Because like a lot of these movies, and we're calling them hood classics because like a lot of people, either in the hood or just like black people growing up, like these are movies that like everyone has seen and everyone knows. So like I name all these movies, and you're like, I've never heard of Belly or Dead Presidents. You've probably heard of like New Jack City or whatever. And these are all movies that like for me growing up, it was like, oh yeah, these are all like classics that you're gonna have to watch at some point. And I haven't seen all of them, but like these were very much so movies that like um everyone, like people in my family and like friends and like family friends and stuff all knew and would talk about, and we're like, oh, these are like the classic movies that you have to watch, in the same way that, you know, white audiences or like non-black audiences or like film audiences in general would talk about things like Goodfellas and like The Godfather, things like that. So it's and we'll talk about like what the hood classics films relationship is to things like Goodfellas and The Godfather, because like I named those two movies for pretty specific reasons, which we will get into in this discussion. So we sort of have like the frame of reference of what it is that we're talking about. This like post do the right thing boom. This is going to obviously be different from like black exploitation movies from like the 70s. And I don't think that these are like operating in a similar sort of realm. And we're also not going to talk about Do the Right Thing that much, because that movie in particular is like in its own weird realm. Like it exists more as like an art house film than an actual hood classic, even though it is a movie that like everyone has seen. I think for this discussion, the two movies that I want to examine most, and we'll throw in a third, but the two are going to be Boys in the Hood and Menace to Society, because I think that they represent two opposite approaches to this kind of movie. So you haven't seen Menace to Society, but you did see Boys in the Hood.
I have seen Boys in the Hood. Now I wish I'd seen Menace to Society, but there's only so much time in a day. But
Yeah.
yeah, this sounds like an interesting conversation.
So before I ask you about your thoughts on Boys in the Hood, just to give the background about what it is that is like different between Boys in the Hood and Menace to Society, both came out in the early 90s after Do the Right Thing. Boys in the Hood, I think in like 91. John Singletary or Singleton? Singletary directed it, wrote and directed it, was like a USC grad, like total like film school nerd. Wrote it when he was like 25 years old. Absolutely insane. Amazing movie. Gets nominated for Best Picture. He gets nominated for Best Director. He's like one of the youngest people, if not the youngest person to ever be nominated for Best Director. Totally floors people. But that movie's approach to growing up in the hood is very moralizing. It's very much so a message of like, here's how we can like do better and break these cycles of violence and things like that that have plagued black communities for so long. And then you have Menace to Society, which is directed by I want to say the Morris brothers, but I might be confusing them with the basketball players. I probably should have looked all this up before to have confirmed my information, but that's fine. So they, I think the Menace to Society came out in like '94, and their background was in mostly shooting and directing music videos. So I think they did a lot of work with like NWA and stuff, you know, back in the day. But Menace to Society is very much so just like a raw look at, hey, here's what it's like growing up here. It doesn't go as far as to say this kind of sucks, but you get the message from the movie just like presenting what that life is, that it does suck. And I think that the two movies are interesting because one is taking all this time to sort of like have a message, right? Like a core theme that it's trying to communicate. And the other one is just a reflection of the reality without any sort of like contextualization or whatever for why it is that that might be happening. It's just like, here's the raw shit that's going down here. And both take place in Los Angeles, in South Central LA. in the early 90s, but are two very different movies. So, Jacob, with that background, what did you think of Boys in the Hood upon your initial watch?
Yeah, I mean, Boys in the Hood on my only watch was extremely well. First of all, I just was noticing. I mean, it's really well shot. It's just really like a good looking film overall in general. And then like obviously story wise, so like I had heard before your comparisons kind of to Stand By Me, which maybe we'll talk about briefly later. But um, I picked up a lot of that from when they were the younger kids, especially when they're going down a railroad tracks to see a dead body. Um, but like that, I mean, obviously it's a stacked cast, and I don't know at the time, Cuba Gooding Jr. and Morris Chestnut. Um, I don't know how well known they were; they're a bit younger. But then you have like Angela Bassett, Lawrence Fishburne, Regina King. I mean, I was like, dang, this
Yeah,
is
it's
this is
stacked.
incredible. Um, Lawrence Fishburne is so good. Um, and it reminded me in a way, and I don't. This is weird because I don't actually like. A lot of people love Dazed and Confused. There was a lot of ways in which this movie reminded me of Dazed and Confused, um,
Hmm.
because it's kind of, especially when it gets to the older boys, they're kind of listless. They're seeking, they're like looking for women and getting high. The difference being clearly like Dazed and Confused doesn't have the looming threat of like gun violence hanging over it, and this extreme poverty, the poverty part of it, that plays into Boys in the Hood, and that the Dazed and Confused guys, you think if nothing, the worst thing that's going to happen to them is they're just going to never grow up and kind of be in this endless cycle of what they're doing. But the worst case scenario for the guys in Boys in the Hood. It's made pretty clear, um, all the way through. Um, and it's just I think even though it's moralizing in a way, and it has its beats where it's like, I mean, Ricky's mom gets the SAT score back, and it's a 710, just enough that he could have made his scholarship for his football. That's a kind of a moment, but I still felt like it was very subtle in its approach to breaking. Like every now, like you have that brief moment when Lawrence Fishburne teaches them a lesson about how gentrification and things like that work, but
Hmm.
that's interspersed in the midst of a lot of what feels still like a lot of just like a reflection of just guys trying to figure out what the heck they're supposed to do, um, and the the influences. I think it was a very powerful scene when um, Trey uh, breaks down in front of his girlfriend, um, and the expectation that you know that all that he's always kind of act that there's always kind of an act going on. Everybody's always kind of got
Hmm.
this act going on, and they're not really able to be real and vulnerable at any point. And to be that way in front of a woman is really looked down on, um, which is of course crosses racial boundaries to a degree. Um, but those were some powerful scenes and some powerful messages about the things that are kind of holding that hold you back, and how hard it and just how hard that environment kind of is. Um, so yeah, that's kind of what I took away from it on my watch.
Yeah, I mean that's all so true. I think some of what you're saying is it's a really well written movie. I think that's one of the most impressive things is that and I was while you were chatting, I was able to pull up um just the IMDb for Boys in the Hood and Menace to Society so that I could get the directors' names right. And it is John Singleton who directed Boys in the Hood and wrote it. And yeah, that script is incredible. There's like so much depth and awareness there. And these movies are at the end of the day just coming of age movies. It's just a different kind of lived experience that we're witnessing, um, which I guess we can just talk about it now, right? It is important for people who grow up in these kinds of settings to see their reality reflected and communicated on the big screen. Also helpful for people who are like not of that background to be able to see that or like learn about it through cinema. I think we've had this discussion in previous episodes where we talk about like, is this more useful or is it just like feeding into stereotypes? I think that these movies in particular, because they are so well made, do more to reflect a reality in a positive or like an informative way than they are just like reinforcing stereotypes about how we think, about black people who grow up in the hood and like, oh, they're all doomed to die at the hands of gun violence or whatever from someone who they probably know. Um, and I don't think that these movies are doing that as much as they are reflecting it in an informative way. I don't know if you had
Well,
thoughts or
yeah,
like an
and I'll
initial
say
takeaway about
as a white guy watching this, I was, kind of particularly tuned into like what were going to be, where were there going to be references to white folks who were basically, I mean, the only white character I remember seeing in the movie actually seeing is
that.
the teacher who's briefly shown. I don't think there's another white character in the whole movie. But it's mentioned in a couple of powerful moments when Lawrence Fishburne gives his diatribe about gentrification and how this cycle continues. That obviously invokes the white folks, and then at the end, after Ricky's death, when Doughboy Ice Cube is looking at the paper or the news or whatever, and he's talking about how they don't even have anything about it. Um,
Hmm.
and he's saying white people don't even really aren't. It's like we don't even exist outside of this bubble. Um, and so, in a lot of ways, you could kind of say this is kind of like the movie that's going on while the white savior movie is happening. You know, it's like this is the
Hmm.
entire separate world that's happening while the white savior movie plays its like part in the other. It plucks one person out of here and creates this fantasy of we're saving this person, but it's just like completely exists. Otherwise, it's just a stereotypical awful world. But it's interesting to me too, like how because the movie does not obviously the movie clearly sets up like this is a cycle that has started and perpetuated by outside forces, but at the
Hmm.
same time, it's very focused on the inertia that's created inside of it. That it's like we can't, we have to fight against the inertia that's been created. Like we can't just play into that, and so it's interesting that even though it talks about those outside forces, it's still to understand. It's saying we gotta deal with what we can deal with inside of this pocket, basically.
And that's the main difference between Boys in the Hood and Menace to Society, where in Menace to Society, the outside forces are very outside. It's like you can feel it happening off the screen, but it is also very easy to lose sight while you're watching that movie that there are outside forces that are creating this cycle. It's a very similar story about cycles of violence that people are subjected to, obviously, like not of their own doing, which I think is the important thing that these movies communicate. Even though they don't explicitly say, like, maybe Boys in the Hood says it more than something like Menace to Society, but these are not conditions that people are like choosing to live in. It's just a very unfortunate reality for a lot of people. And these movies are just showing what that is like, in very different ways. Just to sort of like talk about a few other um hood classic movies that were sort of, popular throughout this run and have been popular for the last 30 years or so. The other one that I really wanted to bring up that I think is like super interesting and sits sort of further on the spectrum from something like Menace to Society is Juice, which is about a group of kids growing up in Harlem who end up finding a gun. And light spoilers, it really just ends up playing like a slasher film with the gun and one of the kids. absolutely amazing. But that movie is very much so doing a growing up in the hood is horrific. It's a terror. It's literally a horror movie growing up in the hood and being subjected to this gun violence like creeping into your life at any given moment is one of the most terrifying things possible. So Menace to Society being this like really raw depiction of that happening, it doesn't go as far as something like Juice, which is just like, yo, this shit's spooky. Like this shit sucks and it's spooky. But I think that there is a through line between all of these movies about that is kind of saying, yo, growing up in the hood, like, kind of sucks. Like, it's not that fun. Um, but I guess I don't know. I can't ask you what you think about the differences between those because you haven't seen them. But like, I guess having not seen them, what how do you think that like you would react to those as opposed to seeing Boys in the Hood for the first time?
Well, the Juice sounds like an interesting, the way you're describing it, proceeding as a slasher gives kind of an extra metatextual kind of commentary of it, to because Boys in the Hood, is in a lot of ways it seems like it's meant to be a pretty realistic depiction of the world and with some um, moral things to say. And then what you're saying about Menace II Society just being a raw depiction, which a lot of people have a hard time, I think, when it's just a raw depiction. Sometimes some people will see that and go, "Yeah, that was really clear. Like this is horrible, and we need to get out of it." Sometimes people, will, if you present a raw depiction of something without commentary, some people read that as it is what it is, nothing we can do to change it, or even a this is just
Endorsement.
life for us, and get over it.
Yeah.
So so the horror aspect kind of also kind of would um, be interesting to lend itself into that as like we're stuck in this horror movie where it sounds like, I'm guessing, light spoilers, it sounds like the gun, obviously the gun gets passed around and people keep getting shot, and it's like the gun is the common denominator. It's the same gun that passes along, or maybe that's
It passes along, but like ends up in the hands of one particular person who then sort of ends up being the like
the
Freddy
slasher.
Krueger,
Okay,
Michael Myers
gotcha,
slasher
gotcha, gotcha.
in the movie. Yeah. And like chasing down the rest of his friends. Um, it's a great movie. And so then looking a little bit further past Juice into some of the movies in like the mid 90s through like early 2000s to sort of get back to the point that you're making about like the raw depiction where then like when does it then become an endorsement of like no this is cool. I think that's what we see like in the latter half of the decade. So I haven't seen New Jack City, so I can't really speak to it that much. But then things like Dead President's Belly and Paid in Full are more in line with like crime thrillers. So Paid in Full is like kind of a version of Scarface in a way, but it's less the message there is less so like this shit will break you and more so just like hey this is what happens and then rappers take like our real life experiences and make millions of dollars off of it, which is a weird way to look at it at the end. But those movies do sort of like teeter into the ground of like endorsing or like celebrating the horrors of growing up in the hood. And like I think we should disclose that neither of us grew up in the hood, so like um I can't like fully take a stance um on whether or not that behavior is like good or like what people should do in terms of endorsing it or not endorsing like their real life lived experiences and all that shit. But just like sort of like understanding it through um lived experiences and like knowing people and watching these movies and all that stuff. um but it is interesting to me that like the further we get away from Do the Right Thing, Boys in the Hood, the less we are like making movies about like how do we get out of this shit, and more movies that are just like versions of Menace to Society where it's like yeah this is kind of that just is what it is. So having not heard of any of these movies, did you look any of them up, or was there even like any like frame of reference for like what these movies might be about, might be communicating, or
Yeah,
anything?
I didn't have the list in front of me, but I had looked up some in an attempt to try and kind of understand a little bit of what we're going to be talking about. I didn't have a lot of opportunity to dive in. I have to say just something for a second. I For a brief second I forgot like what podcast we were on. And I was like, do I need to have three recommendations because like I have no idea what I'm trying to say. Thankfully this is not the canon, so we're good. Um, anyway, um, yeah, no, it's like well, first of all, watching Boys in the Hood is like, definitely want to watch more because it was so good. And you know, this episode when we were talking about this season, we talked about white savior movies as movies by white people about black people for white people, and then we're
Mhm.
talking about this one as movies by black people about black people for black people. But Boys in the Hood is not just for black people. It certainly is catered towards. I mean, it's really speaking towards black
Mhm.
folks in the hood. It's speaking very inwardly. Um, uh, but there's it's good for white people to. I mean, the last part was saying where it's saying white people don't even like feels like we don't even exist to them. It's good for white people to look at this and see this past their stereotypical depictions in their own films. Even if sometimes those lines, I mean, some of the stuff in this movie, I think you said it, is like it's not that far from like a stereotype that might be presented in another movie, but it's presented a little more tenderly, a little more carefully,
Mhm.
more deeply explored. So it's important, and so yeah, I mean, Menace to Society also being so well beloved and rated. Like I'm going to continue down that path of watching these because I'm interested, and I think from a white person's perspective, there's a lot of white people out there who like to um, focus on that inward perpetuation of of the hood and well everybody's just shooting everybody and they get involved in these gangs and they're doing these drugs. If they would just stop that stuff then they would be fine. I've heard that plenty in my lifetime, and it's not completely untrue that there's. I mean, this is what this movie tackles is that there is perpetuation inside of the cycle, but there's also you got to acknowledge where it came from. That it's still
Mhm.
outside forces working on that. That combine. It's like if you like filmed inside a vacuum from the perspective of inside the vacuum versus like pulling out and looking like these folks are just trapped in this cycle that's been created outwardly. It's a whole different perspective. So yeah, I think there's something for white people in these movies, and
Yeah.
not to feel like I'm just like outside of the culture watch, and so much of this is universal. I mean,
Mhm.
just coming of age. It's just again, like I said, with Dazed and Confused. Ultimately, it's guys. They're getting out of high school. They're figuring out what's next. I mean, Ricky's already got a kid. Doughboy feels like he's never like his mom's always loved his older brother more. They're always looking to get stoned. They're looking for um, girls. They're ribbing their friend for being a virgin. Um, there's there's so many things that are just universal in this movie. So it's not something that you're like completely disconnected from as a white person being like I just can't connect. So yeah,
Yeah.
there's plenty out there. It's just and it's funny. My dad's seen this movie. I talked to my dad and
Mhm.
he had seen it, so it's not like completely cut off. But then some movies that aren't probably hood classics. It's just what I think of because like I turn on Tubi
Mhm.
and it's like barbershop and stuff like that. But
Yeah.
it's like, and then used to when we had cable, there was like BET, and it's like
Yeah.
whenever you stop at BET, it's like, well, this isn't for me. Like I like this isn't made for me. I don't. There's no reason for me to watch it because it's not. with I'm not in mind with the people who are making this. It's like
Yeah,
fine. Not that I couldn't
it's a
enjoy any of it, but it's not made for me. It's not really even. Not that it's disrespectful, I guess, to watch it, but it's kind of like weird. It's like, what are you doing? Are you watching me eat people?
yeah. But I mean, so I think that these movies are obviously all made with the intention of being aimed at black audiences, but I do also think that there is, to what you're saying, a lot of validity in the necessity for white audiences to also experience these movies, because it just makes us all like fuller, more aware people walking through this earth. To take it away from race dynamics in America for a brief moment, like when we watch international movies, we get insight into different cultures around the world that we like otherwise wouldn't know about. And although those movies like might be intended for a Korean, uh, you know, Bangladeshi, Costa Rican audience, like we can also as Americans watch it and like gain something from it. So even though these movies are made for a particular kind of audience, or like with a particular kind of audience in mind, there is also something for people from like outside of that community to gain. But going back to like the Dazed and Confused example, that movie feels like it's supposed to be universal, right? Where that experience is supposed to be universal, even though it is very specific to Texas suburbs in the 70s, which is not something that we all experience. But like I watched that movie watched that movie as like a 14-year-old black dude in New York. And I was like, yeah, I get this. This makes sense. I identify with all these people. I think the same can and should be true of these kinds of movies, these hood classics. You watch Menace to Society, and although it might not be your lived experience, you can watch it and say, like, I identify with this person as like a 15, 16, 17-year-old person struggling with understanding their place in the world. Why do you think, and this will probably maybe lead us into our next episode's discussion a little bit more, but why do you think that these movies don't get treated or aren't like viewed as something meant for universal audiences the same way that movies made by white people, made for white people, made about white people are like thought to be super universal? Like no one thinks that The Goonies is just a movie for white people, even though it, you know,
Right, right.
in the same way
You
that,
know, it's interesting to like. I wonder to what degree, like now, I'm not sure what's going. I don't even know a recent film that I can like point to. I wonder how these films were marketed, what limitations existed in the studios. I mean, some of this is still systemic to the core. I mean, um, if studio distributors say white people won't care about this movie because it's about the hood, then they're not going to deliver it to people who are white. And if white people have the general, I mean, they're not wrong. If you put Boys in the Hood in a bunch of suburbs. I mean, white people, not even out of racism, just out of like, if you see Boys in the Hood, you might think, well, this might not be something that's really for me, so I'm just not
Mhm,
gonna go watch. But that's because I mean that kind of lends itself to the difficulties of racial, issues and histories. Because the Goonies, you're not thinking, oh well, these boys grew up by like kind of coastal, and I'm landlocked, so like like what is the
mhm,
environment that you're going to be like, and vice versa. And I don't know. This is what something that I don't know. I think you said you never were in like the hood, but like what someone in the hood is like watching, like the Sandlot. Like there's universal nature to that, but that's also so like comparatively carefree, when
mhm,
their biggest worry is this mystical large dog on the other side of the fence versus, like gun violence and like seeing the horrors that, I mean, the biggest difference is the coming of age in the hood is like you've already seen people shot, killed all around you when you're young. Like movies like The Sandlot and stuff, they're coming of age having never seen many of those things. Standing By Me a little bit more, they live in a world that's a little more um, poor white like they've seen some stuff. Of course, it's Stephen King, so it's effed up
Yeah,
all
but
around
that
him.
movie, like the world that those boys in Stand By Me grow up in, is more similar to the world of Menace to Society than it has in common with something like The Sandlot,
Right? Yeah,
like a
exactly.
thousand percent. And but people don't see people see Stand By Me as being more in line with the Goonies or the Sandlot than Menace to Society because it's white kids. Even though the story is like Stand By Me is kind of a hood classic in a weird way
I mean,
in
it
terms
makes
of the
sense,
issues that those kids are dealing with. Yeah.
but there's a lot of deals with accessibility, and honestly, weirdly, this isn't the be all end all, but the stylization of boys in the hood would
Hmm.
also probably be like something that a white person sees, and it's almost like a shorthand, right? Like boys with a Z in just
Hmm.
in the hood. Like a white person might be like, oh yeah, that's not that's it's not for me. It's not my instead of being something that's just like I don't know if there were just words there that weren't stylized in any way, it might change. Which doesn't need to happen. This Boys in the Hood is a great name for this movie, but
Yeah.
as far as it being accessible and more like white people watching it, it would be like a name can make a part of that difference. But then, yeah, it's the same reason that they didn't make Ray action figures after Star Wars. It's all money. It's all green at the end of the day, and they thought Ray wouldn't sell Star Wars action figures, so they didn't make any. Um,
Yeah.
so
Which I guess is also the reason that a lot of these filmmakers make these movies is because you watch the Goonies, you watch the Sandlot, and it's like, oh, there's nothing that is representative of this like whole faction of the country and their lived experiences. So let's fill that void with these movies. And because we've been locked out or boxed out of the other movies, then there's really no need for us to sort of cater to the audiences that those other movies are catered towards.
that makes total sense. I mean, yeah, it's like because yeah, they've been left out, and at the time, obviously in the '80s, we're not barely removed from segregation at all. I mean, so you know, like people, most of the people involved in movie making were probably white people. Um, and
Mhm.
distributing movies were white people, and theater owners are white people because of the systems that were in place. So it's hard for that to change. Obviously, we're seeing a lot more of that now. We're going to talk next week about blackbuster cinema, which is interesting because that's still a very like in very many ways like we'll touch on Sinners next time we talk, and in so many ways Sinners is very like rooted in black culture, things that white people not necessarily had that experience, but it's still made for a wider audience that can and of
Yeah.
course it's hit like wildfire. Everyone black and white loves that movie. So maybe that's progress, maybe that's some things that have changed since Boys in the Hood came out. Not that not that Sinners is the same kind of movie as Boys in the Hood, to be fair.
No, no.
Um,
And also, I mean, it is important to note, right? We're talking about a very specific kind of movie for black people, for black audiences. Like there are a lot of other movies made by black directors and filmmakers that are about black experiences that like don't necessarily revolve around growing up in the hood. Like there's like Eve's Bayou, which is kind of a spooky adjacent movie about living in Louisiana. Um, Also, weird through line where Samuel Jackson in that movie and Menace to Society plays like a really terrifying father figure. But there's like that. There's like If Beale Street Could Talk, which is a more recent movie, which is about a black experience made by a black filmmaker, but like not a hood classic in the same way that some of these other movies that we're talking about are. But to go back to your point about like the systemic issues, which I think is pretty interesting and kind of a side note, I don't know if you were aware of this, but part of the reason why you probably hadn't heard of a lot of these movies is the people who like directed these were very rarely given the chance to go on to make like bigger, more exciting, more broad reaching films. So like the dude who directed Juice, that was his first movie, Ernest Dickerson, and he had like worked as a cinematographer with Spike Lee on a bunch of movies. But like you watch Juice, and if that you're like this is someone's first movie, you're like this person has the juice. They should be able to make like studios should be lining up to give this person millions of dollars to make more films. It was the Hughes brothers, not the Morris brothers. The Morris brothers are the basketball players. The Hughes brothers are the dudes who directed Menace to Society. They got very few chances in Hollywood to make other things. John Singleton was nominated for an Oscar at 25 years old, and he struggled throughout the 90s and early 2000s to get funding for movies or for studios to be like, oh, we should give you a gazillion dollars to make whatever the hell it is that you want to make. Whereas if these movies were made by a young Steven Spielberg, a young Martin Scorsese, like a
Right.
young Paul
And then
Thomas
by
Anderson, right? Like you
yeah, and then by nature you would be like, oh, this is a really great movie by this director, and then you would go through the back catalog and find, oh man, he had a movie directed nominated for Best Picture I have never even heard of, and then you would watch that. But
yeah,
without
right.
that line, you have nothing to say
Instead of
about
it
it.
being, oh, this is like the only thing that this person was able to direct and it's an amazing movie and they have nothing else. But like, we'll talk about it next week. Ryan Coogler, his first movie, Fruitvale Station, very small independent movie, and people watched it and they're like, "Oh, this dude has the goods. Let's give him a gazillion dollars to make whatever the hell he wants to make." And now he's one of the biggest directors on the planet. And it was a very, very, very different Hollywood ecosystem in the 90s and early 2000s. So we didn't get that same sort of pipeline for a lot of these folks. Like even Spike Lee was making like pretty independently funded movies for most of the 90s, and he was like one of the best directors working that entire time. Um, so I mean, I don't know that if you were aware of that or if you just hear it and you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, it's the latter. I wasn't aware of it because like how would I be? Because that's the whole point. Is like these movies came out in the '90s. They didn't trickle down to me because who was going to trickle them down to me in a.
Hmm.
I mean, I went to a tiny Christian school, white school in a suburb of Montgomery that's very white, and my parents are white, and they don't have. I mean, again, my dad apparently did watch it, but
Hmm.
he wasn't like. Of course, if he watched it when it came out, he wasn't turning around to tell very child age to me like you gotta watch Boys in the Hood with me, because one of the things about Boys in the Hood, again, like I said, with the coming of age, it's like you know, there's a lot of language and things that wouldn't be um, that might be common in a certain environment that in my home would have been like.
Hmm.
I mean, my mom turned off Pursuit of Happiness when it dropped a second f bomb. Uh, like, and
Like the most wholesome movie ever.
I
Yeah.
love Pursuit of Happiness. And so it's like, you know, it's just worlds apart in terms of like my ability to see this. I could not have seen this movie at all until I was like 20 anyway. So, um,
And the thing, I mean, Boys in the Hood is the one out of all of these movies that has transcended the race line more than the others. I think because it is such a seminal movie, and it was one of the first ones of these of this subgenre made after Do the Right Thing. Got so much critical acclaim. Like, understandably, it's an amazing movie. It's probably the most digestible. It's probably the most cinematic, I'll say, out of all these movies. If I were to like rank them in terms of their merit as films, I think Boys in the Hood would be one, Menace to Society would be two, Juice would be three, and then everything else would sort of then be like a tier down. Um, below that. I mean, we could throw in like Crooklyn, Spike Lee's Crooklyn, which is amazing, but it feels weird to put Spike into the same category because he's just like in his own sort of like orbit on his own. But the other question that I wanted to ask you before we wrapped up this discussion, so there are some other movies. So like, have you seen Friday? Did you watch Friday with Morris?
I did not watch Friday with Morris. I later on, out of curiosity, watched some of Friday. maybe all of Friday. I feel like I might have gotten through most of it, and for some reason I didn't get to finish it. But I watched a lot of Friday, and so it was fun. It was a fun time. It was a fun
Yeah,
movie.
Friday's cool. I grew up watching like Next Friday, which probably isn't as good of a movie, but is like that was like on BET all the time. And like yeah, I was watching that and like Barbershop, which are like in a way like a continuation of this genre. But Friday is a cool, interesting one because it's sort of like it's it's dealing with the same issues of like these like cycles of gun violence, and it's not as morally strong as something like Boys in the Hood because it's a comedy. So like it's like taking like a somewhat comedic approach to the whole uh hood classic, like growing up in the hood kind of story. But then even further down from that, and I think you said that you haven't seen this, but you would probably need to watch a few of the other hood classic movies to then understand what makes this movie so funny. But the Wayans brothers did a parody of these movies called "Don't Be a Menace," with a massively long title. Don't be a menace in South Central while drinking your juice in the hood, or whatever.
Right, right,
Like
right.
directly making fun of all of these movies, um, which is like the obvious sort of like endpoint of a subgenre genre of
Right.
flicks. But you haven't seen,
You're clearly a subgenre when you have a parody movie. I mean,
yeah.
yeah.
And I think that was their first parody before Scary Movie. So very funny. You definitely watch a few more of these movies and then go back and watch Don't Be a Menace, and you'll like understand all of the jokes. You'll be like, oh yeah, this is why they're doing that. That's very funny. And I think when the Wayans brothers are doing parody stuff, like they're as good as anyone. So um they're sort of like that's like the button and like the fun ending to the subgenre, even though there were like plenty of movies that were made after Don't Be a Menace, but that's like the nice little button at the end of it. Um, but yeah, I think that's all that I had about Hood Classics. I don't know if you had any other thoughts about what you saw, or like what these movies sort of mean, what you think how you think people should be interacting with them, or anything like that.
Like I said, I mean, I came into this like so unarmed with knowledge because obviously what we're talking about is movies that did not break into mainstream, and there would be no way for outside of a person becoming like a film bro and just like going back and looking, um, it's not reaching the general audience. I mean, most of the people I know were not going to see these movies or heard of these movies. So, but it's I love the idea of watching films about people and experiences that I don't know that I haven't lived. I mean, the Florida Project, everything Sean Baker does, um, which is like fringe white people. Which maybe I don't
Hmm.
know, if Sean Baker can really go into like into the hood because that's not really I don't know if that's his place, but it's the
Well, one of
same.
his movies is about
It I mean it does Tangerine,
two
right?
two black yeah two
Yeah,
black
true,
trans sex workers in LA
true.
shot on iPhone.
So
Yeah.
I mean, it makes
So
sense
he's
for Sean Baker to be in that kind of space, but except, so, but that's the same kind of thing, even though it's white folks. It's like, that's so on the verge. I mean, Anora less so. Anora is a little bit more like a little less real world than most of his movies. But
mhm.
um, everything else that he does is like taking you to worlds that you're like, man, that's crazy that experience. And so, watching these is the same. It's the same kind of feeling, and I think that's great. Um, and like you said, watching international films where you experience like countries that operate so differently. Um, from small life, like what small life is like, which is more like Boys in the Hood, or
Mhm.
Anatomy of a Fall. I was sitting there watching the legal system, going, that's not right." And I had to keep reminding myself it's France. And I'm like, because I've been in so many
Y-
courts in America, and I'm like, what are they doing? Like that is not allowed. And I'm like, and
yeah.
I'd be like googling, and I'm like, that's allowed in France. That's crazy work. Like, um, it's so interesting to see any other cultural or people's experience, and that's how we become more knowledgeable and wise, and able to interact, knowing more about where people come from and trying to work with that. I will. One thing that struck me in this movie, the only thing that I like, I don't know if it was something I didn't understand. I looked it up. I
Hmm.
looked it up afterward. So I guess Dookie has the pacifier that he's always chewing on,
Hmm.
and no one really gives him any flack for that. In the like,
Hmm.
so I didn't know if that was only like a meta thing to be like to like talk like to look at the stunted growth kind of aspect, or I don't know. I just it kind of struck me that in a world where everyone's kind of walking like they've got to kind of put on this front and kind of act tough, that no one's giving Dookie any real issues with like
Yeah.
that's fire in his mouth. It's kind of
Is Dookie's the one who's paralyzed from a shooting, right?
yeah, I guess so. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I
Sometimes I
would
was
assume that it's like a commentary on stunted growth, you know, how growing up in that environment for some people, you know, literally or metaphorically sort of stunts their growth. I think that's what they were getting at, what Singleton was getting at with that. Um, I haven't seen it in like a couple of years, but that sounds like the appropriate reading.
yeah. I mean that seemed right, but definitely when I was watching, that was the one thing that triggered me to be like he's disabled, but he's on this he's chewing on this pacifier, and it's like you would think people might be a certain way toward him for that, and that never really that doesn't particularly materialize in the movie, which is interesting. Um, I love Morris Chestnut in this movie. I didn't recognize him as Morris Chestnut. I knew he looked familiar. I was like, who's this
Hmm.
guy? He looks really familiar. I was like, oh, it's Morris Chestnut. I didn't recognize him with the big like fade, and
Yeah.
but he was in many ways like the sweetest like character that just kind of mostly kept his head down, and of course his fate. Um, that was really interesting to explore. Yeah.
Yeah, man. It's a very unfortunate fate for far too many people. I think movies like this, like you said, opens um, it opens the understanding to people who don't have this lived experience of like what this lived experience can look like, and like will maybe inspire folks who aren't growing up in that kind of world to maybe reach out and try to help people who have been subject to that, so that that cycle doesn't continue, and it's not just on the folks who are within the cycle to break the cycle. Like, you know not to say like go be a white savior, but there are things that you could do to help out, and hopefully seeing some of these movies will inspire folks to do that, so that there aren't more Rickies and Doughboys and whoever the main character whose name I'm forgetting in Menace to Society. There aren't more whatever the character is who Tupac plays in Juice, and so on and so forth. But I'm happy that you got to watch Boys in the Hood. I hope you get to see more Hood classics. I hope you enjoy them. I hope you finally then get to end up watching Don't Be a Menace, and then I think that will fully get you invited to the cookout. I think that's the path.
All right. I'm ready for it.
We'll get you there. Um, Amazing discussion, amazing conversation. You previewed it, but we're going to be talking Blackbusters next time around. So a little Coogler talk, maybe some Jordan Peele talk. Is that it?
Those are the main two. Those are the main two working right now that are. I mean, they were given opportunities to shine, and they have. And we'll see, how many more follow in their footsteps. But yeah, I can't think of any other. I mean, every movie I try and think of over the last few years that would be a blockbuster is either Coogler or Pill. So yeah.
Yeah. Should be another fun one. Jacob, always a pleasure. Uh, that's Hood Classics. We did it.
I just look forward to next week.